Hi, I'm David Taylor, producer and writer on The People's Recorder. Today we have something special to share with you as a bonus, our conversation with folklore expert Dr. Peggy Bulger. She led the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress for a dozen years, and before that she served as Florida's first state folklorist. Peggy had the foresight back when she was doing her graduate research to interview Florida legend Stetson Kennedy about his work gathering Floridians' stories and songs. She got him talking about his time with the Writers Project, and she remained his good friend for the rest of his life. So when we sat down with her for the People's Recorder, we knew Peggy would bring a rich treasure trove of stories. She did not disappoint. Peggy keeps in mind the big picture, like the role of oral history in American life and culture, as well as the close-up experience of how that works in people's lives. Years ago, she even took on the job of retracing the path of the Florida recording tour that Zora Neale Hurston made with Alan Lomax. She connected with the families of the musicians who had recorded songs with Hurston and Lomax in the 1930s, and also with the Federal Writers Project. And my favorite part is that she gave those families the recordings of their grandparents. But I'll let her tell the story. Peggy is a true original with an ear for what Hurston called the boiled-down juice of human living. So sit back and enjoy. We're talking about the Writers Project and how it brings up questions for people now, and one of them is like who gets to tell their stories, and I feel like I'd be interested to hear you talk a little bit about that question in terms of the Writers Project and what it tells us today, and particularly in Florida, but even generally as Americans.
Well, it's interesting because as a folklorist, that's part of what we do as part of our job is go out and talk to people. However, what has happened in recent years is that we have what we call community scholars, which is that people need to tell their own stories without having a mediator, if you will, or somebody asking the questions that they want to know. What do people want to tell us? And this is very interesting because I think during the WPA, they, of course, went through this with the Federal Writers Project. They had the quote-unquote Negro unit. And what Zora Neale Hurston could elicit about truth and about, the real story was very different than what, the White Office could do. And that is no surprise. Well, here we are, we're, many, many years later, almost 100 years later, and it's the same story. We, I think, are more conscious now, those of us who are trained as anthropologists and folklorists, about trying to be able to get out of the way of the story and not asking the questions that we want to know, but letting those questions come from the community. It's like giving a man a fish or teaching him to fish. And it's an interesting phenomenon that's happened just recently, I think, in terms of academia, where there are all these social scientists who have been trained to be the expert to get the story. And we'll get a story, but it may not be the story that people wanted to tell.
Given what you've been seeing sort of going on in Florida right now, I mean, what groups are sort of at that community level grappling most with the idea maybe of like how to capture stories of the real Florida versus like the imagined Florida or what the outsiders Florida is?
Well, here's the thing. In the last couple of months, it's become vastly clear that we are losing control of all the stories. I mean, conspiracy theories are coming up, and I just can't get this out of my mind. Like, oh my gosh, if Stetson was going out today and infiltrating the Ku Klux Klan, I mean, nobody needs to wear hoods anymore. They're just out there. I mean, his tactics wouldn't work now because nobody, you've got somebody storming the Capitol with a Camp Auschwitz t-shirt. Now, what? This is like so beyond my comprehension. And, I think in the last year, I've realized how naive all of us are. We really are looking back at the 30s, and that was a different time. Right now, we've got to really deal with issues that are so beyond just catching the story and being able to impart what life is really like for people. You've got to combat, totally untruths and that people believe and people will act on. And I know this is probably not what is going to be good for the what you're trying to get, but it blows my mind. And I think that, we're dealing now with some very serious things about how people interact and what is truth and what is not truth and what is acceptable as far as, yes, we can't say the N word, but duh, you can go into the Capitol with a Confederate flag.
Right. Well, it was interesting. Yeah. I mean, that Jill Lepore, the historian, was asked, how do we bridge these divides of like even what accepted facts are? And she was saying, well, if I look back, one time period when that seemed to be approached into the public dialogue was in the 30s with the Federal Writers Project. The federal writers going into communities and asking for those stories in a way, sort of trying to find a shared history or at least the roots of what a shared history would look like.
Well, and I think back in the 30s, what they were doing was very, very forward thinking and radical in many ways in terms of even those stories were important. I mean, who cared? But, if we bring it to today, we would be remiss if we didn't bring up the fact that how people get their information and how people react to the other has been vastly, corrupted by social media. And who knew how much it would influence, quote unquote, reality? Because I mean, I have a reality, but it's definitely not the reality of everybody out there. And I it just boggles my mind.
Well, you mentioned Stetson and kind of had the difference between when he started. Now, maybe we could talk a little bit about how, a lot of people who won't know his starting. If you could, well, first sort of where Stetson Kennedy came from. I mean, can you describe what segregated Jacksonville kind of would have been like in the 1930s for a young Stetson Kennedy?
Well, for sure, Stetson was a crusader and ahead of his time in terms of, what was acceptable behavior for a white upper middle class person. And he was really kind of Florida royalty because he had, he was related to the Stetsons, to the Kennedys, to all these names that you see now that are county names. And he was expected to behave in a certain way. You would never be overtly racist or sexist or whatever, but you grow up with, as a folklorist, you grow up with all of that just being so much a part of you, you don't even recognize it. And he was one who really started recognizing it early on. And his family, of course, was very distressed that he was, trying to open their eyes to some things on how unjust and unequal everything was. And of course, in the 1930s, everything was completely segregated. When you think of it, everything was really pretty much completely segregated until the late 1960s here in the South. I mean, even though the Civil Rights Act was passed and, school integration was supposed to happen, but it didn't, And so Stetson was definitely, he was the black sheep of his family. He was doing things that nobody else was even thinking about doing, sending boots to the troops in the Spanish-American War. I mean, and I don't know how that happened. And he was one, when he was at the University of Florida for a very short time, because he did drop out after the first year. But while he was there, he started the first integrated student group. It was, for Florida, that was really, really brave. Or foolish. Every time I think about Stetson's life, I always think, well, either he was really brave or he was really crazy, because he was putting his life on the line all the time, and just devil may care. I don't know. But he also was very disillusioned that, what he was learning in college was not wasn't anything what he wanted to learn. He wanted to learn about life. And so, as he always says, I invented independent studies by just dropping out. And his aunt, I believe, who kind of gave him money over the years, sent his books down, paid to have his books sent down to Key West. He decided Key West was where he wanted to go. And she kind of gave him enough money to get by on, so he could eat and have a place to live. But that's why he could join the Federal Writers Project, because he could sign the pauper's oath. He really was. He had no job. He had no income except, his aunt was giving him, I don't know, $20 a month or something. And back then, I guess that was enough to eat on. And I think probably his happiest years were when he was just one of the folks, and he was raking seaweed off the beaches of Key West as part of the CCC, when then he was tapped to be part of the Federal Writers Project to collect folklore. And they recognized his talent that way. But I will say this, he never again really had much money until the day he died. He had enough to live on, and he was a crusader to the end.
So he moved back from Key West to Jacksonville, and just with the page, yeah.
Well, he moved back to Jacksonville because he had been tapped by the Florida Writers Project to be the head of the Folklore social ethnic unit for Florida. And Carita Course, who is the head of the project in Florida.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation, but there is more where that came from. To hear the full interview, please consider joining our Patreon. Your support will help keep the stories coming and out in the world where they belong. Learn more in the show notes or on our website, peoplesrecorder.info. Thank you for your support. This is Chris Haley. Thanks for listening.